Well, good evening. It's show 8 o'clock on my watch here. This is Ron Ridenhour, and we're going to talk about techniques of flight instruction tonight on the SSA CFI course that we're running here. Thanks for attending, and also thanks for your input. And if you have any ideas, email me or the wherever you can, and try to get at that. And we'll try to improve it as best we can. Here's our panelists. I think those of you who have attended before know our panelists. Rich Carlson, the SSF chairman; Bert Compton, he's a Soaring Safety Foundation trustee and a FAA DP; Ken Sorensen, SSA regional director and a CFI glider; Bob Wander probably needs no further introduction, but he's an advisor of Soaring Safety Foundation, obviously a very experienced glider flight instructor, and has taught the FERC courses many, many times over the years. Myself, a trustee and an FAA DP as well. We do have question and answer available during the webinar. I cannot see those questions, but the other panel members can and will either answer your questions with a email type of message, or will pose them to me during a break in the training, and I'll try to take several breaks while we're going through the PowerPoint slides. So we'll go through the PowerPoint slides, and then the last 10 minutes or so will be a video from the Soaring Safety Foundation site that talks about approaches and landings. So here we go. Topics today from the Chapter 9 will be methods of delivery methods, scenario-based training. Very important topic to discuss, and I'll try to include some scenarios during the training session tonight. Positive exchange of flight controls, distractions, the use of distractions either by the examiner or the flight instructor. Simulator training devices, how to evaluate learners, and endorsements. We'll just touch on endorsements briefly. It's not, we'll have a session later on in the spring, probably in April when I get back from the seniors. We'll talk more about endorsements because that's a really important topic and needs to be discussed probably in a session all by itself. So, flight instructor, practical flight instructor strategies. And these are, to looking at how to train these kinds of things. We talk about scenarios, but so pre-flight briefing prior to the flight, discuss the safety of flight, and that's an important discussion because obviously we're all involved with safety. Flight instructors in particular, but every person who flies needs to have some kind of safety mindset so that we, have a better safety culture within our club, within our local operation, or just ourselves and the overall operation and soaring. We need to think about those elements all the time, to be quite honest. So, and as Rich Carlson would tell you in one of the FERCs, we want to take a proactive stance on safety rather than a reactive. Not that we can't do a reactive if there's an accident or an incident or something like that. React to that accident or incident and try to change things for the better. But if we can kind of look around and see things ahead of time and have a proactive stance on safety, that's even that much better. Pre-flight checks, including checklist usage, and the pre-flight checks include anything from doing a weight and balance and discussing the maneuvers that you might do, or the entire lesson. Today we're going to do this on tow, we're going to do this in free flight, we're going to do this on the landing practice. So, and then I'm emphasizing checklist usage, obviously. Takeoff, tow, and free flight maneuvers. So pre-takeoff checklist, including some kind of takeoff briefing. You know, what are you going to do if the roper becomes detached at 200 feet or at 400 feet, things like that. Some kind of pre-takeoff plan, pre-plan. Tow maneuvers, you know, boxing the wake, things like that. Uh, Slackline recovery. The free flight activities that you might be doing that day, whether it's you know, initially you probably want to talk about just making basic turns, you know, and then lead that into eventually slow flight, and that leads eventually into steeper turns, medium bank turns, and steep turns, and eventually after you know got some practice behind you, you talk about stall and stall recoveries and other things like that in the free flight activities. So emphasis on clearing the area before maneuvers, and we'll talk more about that as we go along as well. I've got a mnemonic that you can use if you choose to try to train people to use that mnemonic so that they always do the same thing before they do maneuvers. So approach and landing phase, you know, we talk about stabilized approaches. I talk specifically about the approach pitch attitude, and I would encourage you to as well, because it emphasizes what you want to emphasize, which is obviously you want to try to maintain a stabilized speed on the approach, and you have to know what that speed should be, but you really want to emphasize the attitude that will produce that speed versus the speed itself. You know, if a person's staring inside the cockpit all the time trying to maintain an airspeed versus establishing and maintaining a pitch attitude that they will then attain that airspeed, and you can glance once in a while just to inside the cockpit just to make sure that you're maintaining the speed that you want. It's much, I think, a much better approach as a flight instructor to stress the pitch attitude of the aircraft, of the glider, instead of staring at the airspeed or other instruments inside. Um, Traffic conflicts, you know, that's an excellent opportunity to produce a scenario that says, you know, we've got a traffic in the pattern conflict, or we have traffic under runway conflict, and things like that. So try to think about the scenarios that you can use, which would introduce traffic conflicts, and then decide what you should do. I mean, you could simulate a traffic conflict. You could say the glider just touched down at the threshold of the runway and rolled out straight ahead and is now sitting in the middle of the runway. What are you going to do? And see if they can then say, well, I would, you know, either overfly it at a sufficient altitude or fly beside it and land beyond it, and then see if they can execute that the way they are thinking. So you should always stress, if possible, to touch down in the first third of the runway. That's you know, gives you many more outs, so to speak, than if you're just barely squeaking into the beginning of the runway, or so high that you're going to land in the last third. So try to stress landing in the first third of the runway, and then a normal roll out. We'll talk about that later on today. Debriefing after the flight. So ADM principles, you know, aeronautical decision making. That's what ADM is, and so you want to make sure that people are thinking about those kinds of decisions that you have to make, and that's an excellent opportunity too, again, for scenario-based training. You can create a scenario that forces them to make some kind of decision and explain it to you as to why they made the decision or would make the decision the way that they made it. Obviously, that doesn't detract or should not be a substitute for good skills. You have to still have good skills. And I know when the PTS/ACS first came out, people were very concerned. Some instructors were very concerned about, you know, not maybe attaining the skill level that we had before. But to be quite honest, the skill level is in there, and you just have to make sure that you do both risk management and aeronautical decision making and skills. All of them are equally important. Risk management, mitigation. You know, how do you mitigate some of the risks that we have every day? and be aware of hazardous attitudes. You know, the person you're flying with, do they have one of those hazardous attitudes, or are they tending toward one? You should be able to identify that and make sure that they're aware of it, and not that it's, well, it is, it could be develop into a bad thing, but just make sure they're aware of it and make sure they're aware of what the anecdote is so that they can concentrate on not having those kinds of attitudes. So the integrating instruction techniques, ground instruction, flight simulation, in-aircraft training. So under ground instruction, you know, discuss the use of the PAVE checklist before every flight. I think that it's really important to use some kind of risk mitigation tool like PAVE. And if you introduce it, you know, late in the program or whatever, I think you're shorting your learner from not being able to develop their own ideas and how they're going to you know, look at everyday flying. I mean, PAVE checklist. You know, pilot. Am I current qualified and feeling good? Aircraft, is it aircraft current qualified and feeling good? Is the environment, you know, whether it's the navigation environment, the airspace we're going to fly in, or the actual weather environment. You know, we have to consider many things about the environment that, and not just the weather. I think everybody kind of gravitates when they talk about environment just to the weather, but there's other things about a flight that you could encounter. So, and then the external pressures. You know, I think I've told a story one time about um, a friend of mine and I were out on a cross country flight, and I had to get back. I needed to go to an event that my wife was hosting, and I had to get back, and we were about 30 or 40 miles away from the field, and the other fellow I was flying with, he was not doing as well, and so I had a external pressure of trying to stay there with him and trying to help him get home, and finally he kind of released me from that pressure and said, "Hey, why don't you just go on back, and I'll make it back, and if I don't, I'll give somebody a call and come get me." So you have to think about the external pressures that you might have, whether it's cross country flying or just local flying. You know, the winds you arrive at the field, the wind's really strong, and you really wanted to take your best friend for a glider ride, but you know, realize that sometimes the winds can be strong enough where you should delay that and do it another day.
Ron, Bob Wander here. Can I weigh in for a moment?
Sure, absolutely, Bob.
Just very briefly to all of you instructors and instructor wannabes, of all the safety checklists that the FAA ever created, this PAVE is my all-time favorite. I use it before every flight, full stop. Thanks, Ron.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for that comment. I agree with you, Bob. I use it diligently, and in almost every check ride debriefing that I do, I reiterate the use of the PAVE checklist because I think it's that important. So, flight review maneuvers, review flight maneuvers, and to be accomplished, including the standards for those maneuvers. So, during ground instruction, you know, you want to talk about the flight maneuvers you're going to do, and make sure that everybody's aware. Your learner, in particular, is aware of the standards by which you're going to evaluate those maneuvers. So, and it's different, you know, if you're evaluating a student pilot who's just getting ready to solo, well, you know, you're not going to evaluate him to the same standards as you would a person who's wanting to be a private pilot and is wanting to get a recommendation for a private pilot. So usually, I think I mentioned before in another webinar earlier about I use the common errors in the glider flying handbook as a method of standardization for student pilots. They shouldn't be making the common errors on a regular basis. So. Flight simulation. This has really gotten to be, I think, a really important piece of training, to be quite honest. We're using it in our glider club. use of the Condor flight simulator to review maneuvers that can't be demonstrated, such as rope brake procedures down low, less than 100 feet, 100 feet or 50 feet or whatever, where you want to train the individual pilot to land straight ahead or land within a few degrees of straight ahead. So I think that's one area that offers an excellent opportunity to train that way. You can put strong crosswinds on the runway and see what the crosswind does for the not only the landing but the approach. How it affects the approach. You have a strong crosswind that's drifting you toward the runway during the downwind leg, and before you know it, you're so close that you don't really have time for a base leg, and you can show that pretty easily without jeopardizing the sailplane or anything else. So I mean, it's really a good training tool. You can make multiple approaches and landings practice in quick succession if that's a training thing that you want to do, and practice when weather does not support actual flight training. Whether it's the winds are too high or the ceilings are too low or whatever it is, it's snowing outside. You can use flight simulation in many of those. And I know that Scott Manley has been a big proponent over the years of flight simulation. And to be quite honest, I join him in his enthusiasm toward that. He's kind of been our leader in that area, and I applaud him for that. In aircraft training, plan activities for an efficient use of time while in the air. So that's up to you, the flight instructor. You should think about how you want to conduct the whole flight, whether from takeoff to landing, and how do you use the time efficiently in the air. If you take a high tow, like use that time to box the wake, practice boxing wake on the way up. You probably want to do stall practice initially when you're at higher altitudes, and maybe do slow flight at the lower altitudes as you get back into the approach and landing phase. So concentrate on stabilized approaches and landing. We'll talk a little bit more about that here. I've got some scenarios that we want to talk about that. And use the Soaring Safety Foundation goal-oriented approach concepts, and we'll talk more about that as we go along as well. So, flight deck procedures, the sterile cockpit rule. Does everybody understand what that means and how it's important? And that mainly it's, the FAA has done studies in that they find that distractions are probably one of the biggest reasons for having runway incursions, for instance. And people get distracted and they're not paying attention to what they're doing. So you're in your motor glider, you're taxiing out, and you didn't hear the tower say, hey, hold short of runway, blah, blah, 927. And before you know it, you've taxied right across 927. And so that's our runway incursion. And we're trying to avoid those. And one way to do that is to have a sterile cockpit and understand what you're trying to accomplish. Write down taxi instructions and review them if necessary. And if you're on a towered airport and you're in a motor glider where you're taxiing around on your own, well, if you don't know for sure that you were cleared to cross that runway, stop and ask again. Everybody, the tower, yourself, everybody would rather that happen than risk some kind of mid-air or mid-ground collision. So sterile cockpit during taxi, takeoff, and landing for sure, and then flight below 10,000 feet except for cruise flight. So during climb, again, you should be thinking about where you're at, whether you're on tow or whether you're in behind a motor glider or a touring motor glider where you're climbing up. So the use of distractions. I use distractions on check rides to see if the applicant will get distracted by what I'm trying to. Hey, look at that building over there. It looks like a thermal breaking loose, and I try to use it during critical times of flight. To be quite honest, I try to purposely distract them, and that's maybe a dirty trick, so to speak, but. What I'm expecting them to say and what you should be training your applicants and your learners to say is, hey, I need to not be distracted right now. We'll discuss this later. because that's what you would expect them to say if it was their friend flying with them. If they're, hey, look at that eagle over there, or whatever. Or what do you think about the baseball game that happened last night? You would expect them to say, now's not the time to discuss those things. I need to concentrate on my flying. So you need to create scenarios like that that will show, you can show that your learner, your pilot that you're training can try to eliminate distractions and be a little bit safer. So, and the positives change the flight controls. That's a three-step process that the FAA has delineated. Something like you have the flight controls, and then the person taking the flight controls says, "I have the flight controls," and then the person giving up the flight controls repeats it one more time. You have the flight controls. So the purpose is to verbally communicate who's flying the aircraft at all times. If you, the instructor, want to induce slack in the tow rope, I use that as a scenario. You'd have to use those three commands, that three-step process, to first take over. I have the flight controls, and you expect your learner to say, you have the flight controls, and I would say, I have the flight controls. And I usually tell them when I'm flight instructing or examining, I say, now follow me on the controls because I'm going to return the controls with you once the slack has been induced. So then I'll induce some slack and I'll say, you have the flight controls. I expect them to say, I have the flight controls. And then I'll repeat that you have the flight controls. And it's up to them then to recover the slack out of the tow line. So that's a practical application of how you might want to handle that. Are there any questions, Rich or Bob or anybody that you're looking at that maybe we need to address?
There was a question about the PAVE checklist that both Rich and I have done our best to answer. Over.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's like I said, it's an important thing. It's a risk management tool, as Bob would tell you, and I would tell you, and I think that it's really an important risk management tool to use.
So Ron, there is a question here regarding the exchange of flight controls.
Yes.
Would you mind talking about instructors using the controls without a positive exchange procedure where safety is not a concern?
Well, newer instructors will tend to what I call ride on the controls, be a little bit too quick to take over, and unless it's an absolute necessary procedure, either because of the you're about to have a midair collision. I mean, in that instance, it's no doubt about that the flight instructor should take over if they can't discuss it or talk about it fast enough. But in general, the flight instructor shouldn't, because realistically, when you're sitting as the instructor, you're sitting behind the learner, and they can't see that you're on the controls. All they can do is feel that something's happening to the controls, and they might question it, whether that's something that the air is doing or whatever versus what you're doing. And so I would really recommend quite heartily, if you want to take the controls for whatever reason, you should do this three-step process. Otherwise, for the most part, I mean, there's always exceptions, but for the most part, you should try to stay away from the controls so as to not inhibit them or cause a false sense of the movement or the pressures or whatever to move the controls. So I would recommend, even as new instructors, that you try to stay away from the controls as much as you can. I know it's a little bit tough when you first get started. I was there once too, but you really need to try to let the learner fly the glider, and so that they can properly adjust to the pressures that should be on the controls. Does anybody else have any other comments about that?
If I understand the question correctly, if it's a non-safety issue, perhaps you're teaching somebody a little bit more stick and rudder skills for thermaling or whatever. But if it is a safety issue, repeat, if it is a safety issue, I generally wait and give the candidate enough rope to hang himself or herself before I intervene, because I want them to see when I intervene forcefully, I have the flight controls, that they have gotten us into a situation that required intervention. I want them to feel the pain, because then I know they will remember. It will be burned into their memory, and they will know this is not a cliff I want to go close to again. Over.
Yeah, that's a good point, Bob. I would agree with you. Okay, a few training tips here. Integrated flight instruction, the use of outside references with the occasional quick glance at the instruments. You know, it's difficult. Soaring is a little bit different than airplane flying in that I find an awful lot of applicants when I'm doing a check ride or something are too internal, using the trying to use the horizon and not the horizon, but the instrument inside the airplane, like for steep turns. I mean, that's a habit that they have. I found that they are hard to get out of. But in a glider, it's a little more. It's really important to keep your eyes outside, because in gliders we're a little more prone to flying close to other gliders, whether it's in a thermal, gaggle of thermals. I mean, as I'm sure some of you have seen pictures of gaggles. I mean, I've been down, and I know Ken has too. We've been down, and Bob Wander's been there. Rich Carlson's been there, down in Florida at the seniors, and I'm not kidding. I had my backseater count once how many gliders were in our thermal, and he counted 29 in the same thermal, and we were all probably within 2,000 feet of each other, from top to bottom. So I mean, it can be quite hectic in a gaggled thermal, and so you got to keep your eyes outside, and you got to listen for your instruments. The rate of climb, the variometer, and stuff like that. It has to be audio, and then you can also listen for collision avoidance. With the FLARMs, you get a collision avoidance alert as well. So I can't emphasize enough. You got to keep your eyes outside for mid-air collision avoidance, to be quite honest. So the development of habit patterns, such as the use of checklists. The checklists are there for a reason. They're there because the pre-takeoff checklist is there because people have taken off with the canopy unlatched, believe it or not. And some of them are successful in holding it closed while they're on tow. Some are not successful in holding it closed and lose the whole canopy, or lose control of the glider. Worse yet, lose the control of the glider because of the distraction of the canopy opening. And so you got to develop good habit patterns, and there's reasons for the checklist that, whether it's the dive brakes closed and locked, or the canopy closed and locked, or the release checked, or whatever it is. So try, really put the use of checklist high on the list of things to do. As an instructor, it's up to you to operate efficiently. And one of those things is operating the sailplane efficiently, or operating efficiency of the sailplane, or the use of performance speeds, cruise flight between thermals, thermaling speeds, final glide speeds, things like that. So try to think about that. That's not necessarily all stick and rudder. But that's more of how fast you could be going between thermals, or on final glide, or when you're thermaling. Procedures are important as well, and I use this 4-season and E as a before doing maneuvers, and it stands for clear the area, doing clearing turns. Congestion, are you flying over congested area? Because if you are, you probably don't want to be while you're doing maneuvers such as stalls and things like that. Clouds, are you clear of the clouds? Or you have the proper cloud clearances. It reinforces what those cloud clearances should be. And I am chagrined to say that, unfortunately, in our sport, people aren't as diligent as they should be about staying 500 feet below the cloud base. And my point about that is not only isn't an FAR, but to be quite honest, I find that I can't really tell where my next thermal is going to be if I'm right up next to the clouds. I can't see out where I'm going and things like that, and I find that it's very inconvenient and not only unsafe but inconvenient to be up close to the clouds. So try to really pay attention to the regulations and make sure that you stay at 500 feet below the clouds. Configuration. So if you're changing the configuration of the glider for some reason, whether that's a little bit more applicable for airplanes, but it's somewhat applicable for gliders as well. What flap setting do you want to be doing this maneuver at? Whether it's a 45-degree banks thermaling type turn, or maybe you're doing stall maneuvers where you're practicing those stall maneuvers with partial dive brakes open like you would in the pattern. And so, make sure that the configuration is what you want it to be before you do the maneuver. And then emergencies, kind of consider what would you do if something happened during the maneuver that might require you to make an off-airport landing or handle some other kind of emergency, whether it's a potential last second you see something out of the corner of your eyes and you have to maneuver the glider aggressively to avoid another aircraft. So there are several kinds of emergencies that you might want to consider when you're doing maneuvers. So, and understand that the PTS, in our case, the PTS has maneuver criteria, and so you want to fly within those criteria. It's not that you can't occasionally exceed that criteria, but you can't exceed it and just stay exceeding it. So you want to maintain, as if you recognize that you've exceeded the criteria in the PTS, you want to try to get back to within the criteria as quickly as you can. So see and avoid. I mean, unfortunately, this has come up, recently with the accident in Washington D.C. I saw that one of my fellow glider pilots up in Wisconsin, he's a doctor, and he put something on YouTube a few days ago about how bad the human eyeball is for being able to see other aircraft and avoid them. And so it's not unfortunately, that see and avoid didn't work, unfortunately, the other night in Washington, D.C. Granted, it had other extenuating circumstances, the night vision, possibly the use of night vision goggles, being at night with all those lights in the background and things like that. It's almost impossible to see another couple of dots of light from another aircraft. So, but the same is true in gliders. I mean, gliders are pretty tough to see, especially on some kind of a collision course. As you may or may not know, if you're on a collision course with another aircraft, that aircraft is just a tiny little dot in your canopy, and it could be a bug, and it's the size of a bug when it starts out, and the likelihood of you seeing it before it gets to be a really big in your windscreen is not. It's tough to do. It's really inordinately tough to do. That doesn't mean you shouldn't continue to scan and scan in sections, scan in sectors. So 20 degrees at a time, 20 degrees, 20 degrees, 20 degrees as you scan. Gives your eyeballs a chance to refocus in between the scanning. So whether you're thermaling or whether it's during an approach or whether it's just in cruise, we have other tools that help us with that. We've got the FLARM that's getting more and more popular all the time, and that helps us with trying to determine where any kind of collision hazard might be. So, interestingly enough, if you look at the statistics, the most of the collisions are in day VFR conditions, recreational flying, and a third have CFIs on board, which means you've got two sets of eyeballs that didn't see the aircraft, the collision coming. And many times it's with operations between you and a faster moving aircraft. I know in our glider club, we have 737s coming by us all the time, and they're going to Midway Airport, and below 10,000 feet, they have a restriction of 250 knots, which that's 4 miles a minute. So, I mean, from the time they're a little speck on the canopy till they're big in the canopy is probably going to be less than 30 seconds. And so you really have to keep scanning all the time and really be vigilant about that. Any comments about that, guys?
Here's Bert.
Yeah,
Actually,
Bert.
I showed something at the actually the Coast Guard down in Miami. I held a seminar back then and batted them. If you fly to the Bahamas, we can't find you. And what the point was, let me see if it'll work. Everyone look at Ron and don't look at anywhere else. Okay? Can you see clearly the rest of us? You see what I'm saying? That's all you got in good focus. Usually I hold a bottle up right next to my head. Say, look at my nose. What's it say? And people are amazed at how fuzzy it is. Your true focus is very, very small. Are we all looking at Ron? Can you see Bob? No. Can't see me either, can you? Okay. That's my technique. That's why flying is so important.
Thanks, Bert. Thanks for those words of wisdom. Okay, we're going to get more into this as we go along. So I'm just kind of going to just present it here. Demonstration performance. There's an explanation phase. There's a demonstration phase. Usually the demonstration phase is by the explanation and demonstration phases are done by the instructor. There's a learner performance phase. There's an instruction supervision phase. So, the learner performs and the instructor supervises and evaluates what they're doing. And the telling and doing, instructor tells, instructor does. That's kind of the first phase, demonstration phase. And learner tells, instructor does. This kind of helps the learner to maybe cement in what is trying to be accomplished. And if the instructor does exactly what the learner says, if they say, turn right, and the instructor turns left, well, it points out to the fact that the learner can see that the message doesn't always get through. Learner tells, the learner does. So again, that's kind of what I've had a lot of people talking to themselves, so to speak, as they're trying to do maneuvers. And then learner does, instructor evaluates, or examiner evaluates, and that's what happens on check rides. So let's delve into it a little bit here. Scenario number 1. Introduction to tow maneuver. So I really, I've never seen this written down in the book, what I'm about to discuss here. But I think that it's, I personally think I've had good success with it. So I tend to, when you're first instructing on the tow maneuver, I talk strictly about the vertical motion of the glider relative to the tow plane. And I want the learner to notice, is the glider climbing relative to the tow plane, or are they descending relative to the tow plane? And then they have to know how to correct, rather than talking about position, because the movement of the elevator in this case is different depending upon the position of the glider, but it's always the same if you're only looking for the motion. So if the glider is climbing relative to the tow plane, it's going from normal high tow position to a higher tow position, or it's going from a low tow position back to a middle tow position. If the vertical motion is climbing, you want to use forward stick or nose pitch down elevator, right? And vice versa. If it's descending, you want to use back stick or nose pitch up to stop the vertical motion. Once they're able to recognize and stop the vertical motion, they can hold any position that you want them to hold. Whereas if you emphasize the position right away, they may not be able to hold the position because they tend to either over control or under control. The horizontal motion is the same way. You know, I've seen people on check rides been taught to, if they want to move to the side, to use rudder. I tend not I tend to disagree with that because I've seen people in a full slip. They've had the rudder hard over in one direction and they let the wings bank in the opposite direction and they're actually slipping behind the tow plane, but they're not moving in the direction that they want to move with the rudder. And it's because they don't understand what the bank of the sailplane is doing behind the tow plane. So same thing with the horizontal motion. You know, it's the side control of the stick, side to side with the stick, and you're controlling the bank. And so if the wings are slightly banked to the left, you should be moving to the left. And the correction is to bank the wings back to level again. The wings are banked slightly to the right, you're going to move to the right. The correction is to bank the wings back level again. Versus trying to hold a position. You know, if you were, let's say that you're off to the left side of the tow plane, but you're moving to the left. Well, the correction would be to bank the wings back level again, right? But if you were moving to the right, if you're off to the left side of the tow plane and you're moving to the right, in other words, you're moving back toward the center line of the tow plane, the correct motion is to stop the right hand movement with left bank or leveling the wings in that case, because the horizontal motion is being caused by the bank of the wings. And so, and it should be a coordinated aileron and rudder when you're correcting the bank of the wings on tow. Coordinating aileron and rudder. So once you get that idea across, that all they're trying to do on tow is stop the relative motion of the glider to the tow plane. They can hold any tow position you want them to. They can hold a high tow position. They can hold a low tow position. They can box the weight much easier because they understand what's making the glider move left or right, up or down, relative to the tow plane. It also aids in the slack tow line recovery methods. You know, there's a couple of different methods that you probably might want to entertain training, and you were probably trained yourself. You know, if the slack is absolutely, well, like in a wave condition where you're in and out of a rotor, chances are you probably want to try to use a little bit of dive brake to stabilize the condition. I know I've been in rotor before. It's been severe enough where I've used a little bit of dive brake control just to try to slow the glider down and stabilize the whole situation. But normally the slack in the line is caused by the fact that the glider is out of position and gaining or accelerating relative to the tow plane. As soon as you stop that acceleration, the slack is going to start coming out all on its own. You know, Bert, I think, has a really good video, and we'll take a look at that in a future time about how to recover from slack in the line. And so, on the soaring safety side. So, another scenario that you might want to consider is the release from tow procedures. You know, obviously, you always want to clear the area before, because what's going to happen after you release? Well, you're going to make a 90-degree turn to the right. The tow plane's going to make a 90-degree, not bank, but a 90-degree heading change to the left and fly away from each other. You know, I know there's been at least 2 mid-air collisions that I'm aware of where both aircraft made a 360-degree turn and they met back together again. And like I said, I know of at least 2 mid-air collisions where that happened. So you want to clear the tow release area after you release, and then also continue to clear the area for other traffic. You know, many times if you're in a situation where other sailplanes are flying, well, you want to try to go over and fly with them in their thermal. You know, they might find another sailplane in a thermal or something like that. So you want to keep track of where the tow plane went to and look for other sailplanes and maybe try to go over and join them in a thermal. Scenario number 2, stall maneuver. Obviously, one more time, clear the area. You know, if we look at the ACS, the airplane ACS, Airman Certification Standards, the number one item in every skill is to clear the area for the maneuver. That's not true in the PTS because in general, the area clearing is done in the preface of the PTS, which says you should clear the area before maneuvers as a generic statement. But in the ACS, they made it more less generic and more of a dutiful obligation that you have is to clear the area. So stall maneuver, always clear the area. Now, that doesn't mean you can't kind of set up for the stall ahead of time, but you should clear the area while you're trying to set up for the stall. Full stall recognition and an attitude recovery. So, you know, for the private pilot, you have to do full stalls, right? Which means you have to establish a pitch attitude that you know the glider will stall in. You know, I've seen people trying to establish a very shallow pitch attitude in the ASK-21. And to be quite honest, the glider it's difficult to demonstrate a clean stall break in a very shallow pitch attitude. You might, one thing that happens is you might find yourself in a very steep descent and you're just maintaining the stall pitch attitude in a very steep descent without really getting a full stall. But in essence, you are stalled because of that high rate of descent that you have. And then I emphasize attitude recovery. You know, you want to recover to what you know is the proper attitude. The first thing in recovery is to pitch the nose down so that you reduce the angle of attack and get the wing flying again. And then pitch the nose back up again to an attitude that will result in a normal flight attitude. If you leave the nose pitch down too long, you know, you are losing excessive altitude. And to be quite honest, the only time that a stall is, well, not the only time, but one of the times when a stall is critical is when you're, like, say, close to the ground, basically like turning your final or on final approach trying to get over wires or something like that. If you stall the glider down close to the ground, you really have to, you need to be able to recognize that situation coming ahead of time before the stall ever occurs, which is another reason that we practice recognition of stalls before we practice the recoveries as well. So we have level flight, we have turning flight. You know, if you look at the PTS, it talks about a shallow to medium bank turn, not a steep bank turn necessarily for turning flight, but a shallow to medium bank turn. And it talks about using different configurations like approach to landing scenario where you might have the dive brakes partially deployed and doing stalls in that configuration. So steep turns, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to just make a comment on the clearing the area. I tend to encourage my pilots not to do 360s to clear the area because that looks like a thermaling turn to somebody. You might be drawing them in rather than keeping them away.
Good point, Rich. Thanks. Yeah, I tend to use the 290s. I think that's somewhat typical, but that's not absolutely necessary. But I tend to use the 290-degree turns. But I agree with you. You shouldn't be doing a 360 because, as Rich pointed out, that might, you know, somebody might be attracted to your position and come over to see if you're working a thermal. So, good point, Rich. Thank you. Steep turns. It's my favorite maneuver because I think it involves a lot of correlation of different ideas and thoughts. I won't get into that this time, but another time I'll talk about the steep turn maneuver and what speed you should be flying it at and what you should be doing while you're in the steep turn. But at any rate, in a nutshell, you want to clear the area before you do it. A thermaling scenario is probably the most common scenario that you would be doing steep turns in. And if you can get in a, utilize the, if you actually have lift that day, you can utilize that lift to do the steep turns and maybe climb a little bit, at least not sink as fast, and be able to practice more steep turns than you might otherwise. I usually recommend that you do at least a 720 and even a 1080, 2 or 3 turns as a minimum when you're introducing steep turns, because it allows your learner to get accustomed to the G loadings, the pitch attitude that's necessary, the bank angle that's necessary. How do you maintain that bank angle? Some gliders have a little the sides of the panel are cut at 45, interestingly enough, and so you can line up the side of one of those sides of the panel to the horizon to determine the bank angle. Otherwise, the screws, the corner screws of any instrument is set at 45 degrees as well. So you could use the corner screws of an instrument to help you with that 45-degree bank angle as well. But the pitch attitude is really important as well. I mean, you want to maintain an appropriate speed, and that's generally that's a speed that's going to keep you from stalling. Again, you could get more into it, and I could spend the rest of the night talking about it, to be quite honest. But I'm not going to this time. Another time we'll delve into the nuances of the steep turn a little bit more. But pitch attitude is really important. The bank angle is another really important. Maintaining orientation and being able to roll out at the prescribed heading that the examiner or the flight instructor wants you to roll out on. So that's kind of gives you a little overview of what's coming.
So we got a couple of questions here, Ron.
Okay.
There's a couple questions regarding should you make your clearing turns left and right, right then left, or do you have a preference?
Well, that's there is a reason to do it left and then right. The reason would be because if an aircraft was approaching you from behind, they would want to be passing you on the right. So if you do your first clearing turn to the right, you might be turning into someone who's approaching from behind. Versus if you do your first clearing turn to the left, you would probably not be being overtaken by an aircraft from behind. But it's just the main thing is to put your head on a swivel and look around. Even if you decide to do it to the right first because of to the left is a hill that you don't want to turn into. You have to have your head on a swivel and make sure that the area is clear before you make that turn. So it's not that you wouldn't absolutely be prohibited from making a right-hand clearing turn first, but certainly you want to consider the fact that an overtaking aircraft from behind might be coming up on your right. Does that answer the question, you think, Rich?
Yes, that does.
Okay.
There's a question, what about steep turns, left then right, all in one direction?
Well, you gotta teach steep turns in both directions. Obviously, we all probably have a favorite direction to turn. I know that my favorite direction to turn when thermaling is left. Don't ask me why, but it just is. And if I'm really in a critical situation where I need to find some lift and work it accurately and stuff, within reason, I try to turn left. If there's other aircraft already in the thermal and they're turning right, I'll follow them. But it's kind of a personal preference, to be quite honest, to some extent, as long as there's no other um, extenuating circumstances that would dictate a turn in the other direction. So, um,
I guess the question is, do you have them if they do a left turn, do you have them immediately do a right, or is there a break between when
yeah,
demonstrating?
well, that's the steep turn maneuver in a commercial pilot airplane test, but that's not the steep turn maneuver in a glider test.
Okay.
So no, I don't. I usually have them demonstrate a steep turn, usually a 720, in one direction, and then we roll out of that and they can readjust themselves and roll into a steep turn in the opposite direction.
Bob Wander here, just as a fairly high-time instructor. Anytime I have a candidate who has a preference on which way he or she likes to circle in the thermal, I make sure they never do it while I'm in the back seat. I force them to confront the fact that you should be able to turn a glider left or right in steep turns with the same agility you turn a bicycle or a car. Over.
Yeah, I agree. And when I'm, out there practicing, I do that consciously as well, Bob. I must admit that I consciously do right turns and thermal in turns, stuff like that, just so that I'm try to be equally practiced. And so good point. And to be quite honest, I consciously have to work at the turns to the right because I tend to turn left.
So there's
And
another
yet-
question on steep
Okay.
turns in thermals and using that as a mechanism to do the spiral dive recovery. Starting with a steep turn and letting it go into the spiral dive. Is that a way that you teach? Anyone?
Yeah. Does anybody have a comment about that? I'm trying to think of what my comment would be about that.
Bert Compton is typing an answer. This is Bob Wander.
Hi,
They're
Bob.
not quite. Hi. They're not quite the same thing. The
Yeah.
point of the spiral dive is to train the candidate to recognize that it is not a spin and that it's not a stall.
Yeah.
The point of a steep turn in the thermal is that a shallow turn will not get you climbing, so you will use a steep turn you'll do whatever it takes to put altitude on the altimeter. So I think that they should be kept separate. Over.
Yeah. I would agree with you, Bob. Yeah, I would agree with you.
Okay.
That's a good question, though. That's a good question.
There are a couple questions regarding what bank angle you need, 60 or 45.
Well, I believe that PTS says 50 degrees for the commercial, and it says 45 for the private.
Plus or minus, whatever.
Yeah, I have it in my notes when I'm giving a check ride, and I'm at a loss for remembering exactly. I think it's for the commercial. It's I want to say it's +0 -5, but I'm not
Yeah.
positive of that. And for the private, it's +or -10. So,
There's a question here on the clearing turn. Can you turn right and then consider that the first half of your clearing turns? As you release from toe and make your right turn.
well, sure. I mean, if you're trying to maximize your performance and the maneuvers that you're going to do during that flight or something like that, certainly you could consider, your first 90-degree turn, a clearing turn, and then turn back and complete the clearing of the area and go from there. I mean, you'd want to be really careful to make sure that the tow plane has cleared the area as well. But certainly, yes, you could. I would say yes, you could do that if you chose to. That's probably not too typical, but it certainly, would be maybe a little more efficient as far as the altitude that you have. Okay, let's move on here.
For the online questions.
Okay, let's talk about the approach and accuracy landing, because I'm going to show you a video later, video that Bert Compton made years ago about the approach and the accuracy landing, the pattern specifically in the accuracy landing. So we like to stress at the Soaring Safety Foundation the goal-oriented approach concept, and what that is, I'll try to, and Rich, you chime in if you need to, or Bert or whoever, Bob. It's basically, the goal is to land at a certain spot on the ground, whether it's a runway or an off-airport landing or whatever. Your ultimate goal is to land at that spot safely. And so how you get to that goal is kind of up to you. And so if you're not in a position to fly, let's say that you're back at your home field and you're not in a position to fly over to the quote unquote IP, the initial point in the pattern, but you So you have to modify what you do so that you reach the goal that you're trying to do, whether it's modify it and just fly an abbreviated pattern. Maybe you just fly a base leg and a final leg. Maybe if you're accustomed with the runway, normally you fly a left-hand pattern, but you're up on the right side of the runway, you probably want to make sure you're probably better off or safer to fly right-hand pattern. If there's other aircraft in that pattern, like, in some airports, airplanes fly left-hand patterns, the gliders fly right-hand patterns or whatever. So if you're in conflict with another aircraft's pattern, when you're aware of that, you should make sure that you make appropriate calls on the radio if you have that available to you, or at the very minimum, keep your eyes on your head on a swivel and keep your eyes looking out all the time to make sure there's no other aircraft on an opposing pattern to what you're having to do. But the idea behind the goal-oriented approach is to make sure that you fly safely and don't try to always fly the same pattern, so to speak, no matter what your altitude. And so really try to adjust the pattern such that you can get to the goal at the appropriate spot. I.e., let's say you have a really strong wind down the runway today. And when I say strong, I'm going to say 20 knots. Straight down the runway. And you fly downwind a little bit farther than you should have, and you start that turn on the base leg, and suddenly you realize that you are too far. I mean, you're going to have to use all the available glide performance of the glider just to get back to the runway. Well, you could adjust that pattern and not fly a perpendicular base leg, but fly a 45 toward the airport, and that will, so you make more than a 90-degree turn out there instead of on base leg. You make it so that you're on a 45-degree base leg to the final approach. And so you have to do whatever is necessary, and you want to train your learners to do whatever is necessary to make that goal. Do the things that are necessary. And at the same token, if you're too high on base leg, maybe adjust the pattern out a little bit farther so that fly out away from the runway a little bit while you are on base leg. The approach pitch attitude. So you want to fly at the proper approach speed, and that's a further discussion that, what is the proper approach speed? Basically it's 1.5 times stall plus wind considerations, the half of the headwind and all the gusts. And we'll discuss that further, but that's basically the methodology that I use, that I teach. And so, but more importantly, you want to teach the proper approach attitude to attain that speed, versus looking at the airspeed indicator all the time while you're on the approach. If you're looking at the airspeed indicator, you're looking at the wrong spot. You need to be looking out ahead, and Bird will tell you this. The approach attitude is out ahead of the glider. It's not off to the side of the glider. It's not inside the glider. You can glance inside to make sure that approach attitude that you're maintaining is maintaining the approach speed that you want, but you should emphasize the approach attitude. And I kind of don't talk about the speed. In fact, when I tell somebody, when I'm first teaching them, I've already taught them what the approach speed attitude is, and I will say on downwind leg, now you want to fly the approach pitch attitude. I don't tell them, now you want to fly the approach speed. I tell them you want to fly the appropriate pitch attitude that'll give you the speed. So,
Ron,
Sure.
Bob Wander here. Can I weigh in for a moment?
Absolutely.
Over the years, 40-some years of flight instruction, it took me about 25 years to figure out the best way to handle this issue with ab initio students is to cover up every single instrument in the glider, bar none. And their first 5 flights, they have no flight instruments, none, to look at. And if they're looking at the yaw string, I rip that off the canopy as well. And what they learn is that they don't need any instruments to know what the glider is doing. The glider is telling them all the time: pitch, noise, control field, etc., control response. Once they do those first 5 flights, obviously with an instructor in the back seat, when I uncover the instruments, I say, well, I don't need these. And they're absolutely right, as long as you can see if you're in VFR conditions. So I strongly recommend that the law of primacy supports this approach. They learn to fly without instruments before I ever let them see the instruments, and they do just well. Quite often, they will actually land the glider on flight number 2, dual flight number 2, or dual flight number 3. I'll handle the air brakes. They handle every other thing. So for you instructor wannabes, you might think about that, and perhaps it will help you. Over.
Yeah, that's a good tip, Bob. I've done partially that. In fact, for a commercial check ride, you have to do a no altimeter approach. So that's absolutely, that's a little more advanced training. But I don't disagree with you. I mean, I think that you mentioned that the fact that the law of primacy would dictate that if you learn them without the instruments, you'll be able to fly them. And I know I had when I was learning how, I had, bare minimum instruments. And so I think we had an altimeter and airspeed, and that was about it. So, but I agree with you. That's not a bad approach um, to have. And in fact, it's a good thought. And depending upon you, the instructor, whether you agree with that or not, or as you get more experience, you'll probably see some of the merits of doing that. So, crosswind correction. Okay, so you want to consider all the crosswind ideas. Number one, are you going to use a crab technique? Like, probably on downwind leg, you'll probably use a crab technique to correct for the crosswind. On final approach, you'll probably use a side slip, more than likely, to correct for the crosswind. And you want to consider what the base leg is going to look like, especially if you have a tailwind on base leg. Because I'm telling you right now that generally what I have observed happening with a crosswind, that's where you'll have a tailwind on base leg, is that the applicant won't apply enough crab into the wind on downwind leg, so they tend to drift a little bit toward the runway on downwind leg. Then they turn on the base leg, and suddenly they realize, hey, they're way too close, and now they got a tailwind on base leg, and it tends to turn on the final, and from a kind of a downwind position. And so you get blown past the center line of the runway, and you end up turning on the final from a downwind position. Unfortunately, this tends to lead to the possibility of doing a skidding turn, because you're trying to hurry that turn on the final rather than using an appropriate amount of bank, a higher bank angle. You're trying to skid the turn and trying to manipulate the rudder to get it around the corner. You get a little bit slow and you're slipping, or you're skidding rather, and you get a little bit slow. That's that thing about, that's the perfect scenario for entering into a spin. If should you stall the aircraft, you could possibly enter into a spin. So skidding turns are I've heard the, if I ask somebody on a check ride, what's a scenario where you might get into a spin, I've always get the answer of, well, you have to stall and be uncoordinated. And while that's true, it's not fully true, because in general, a slipping turn, it's very, very difficult to, first of all, stall the aircraft, and it's almost impossible to get into a spin out of a slipping turn. Now, nothing is impossible. So I will be the first to admit that nothing is impossible, but it's very difficult to get into a spin out of a slipping turn. So just the fact of being uncoordinated is not the whole story. You have to be uncoordinated in a direction of skid. You have to be in a skidding turn to be more susceptible to entering a spin. So what's the remedies for that? Well, crab a little extra on the downwind leg so that you have a little more time for the tailwind on the base leg. Start your turn on the final sooner. If you start the banks on the final sooner and you, I mean, the worst thing that can happen is from that standpoint is you get turned on the final a little early and you roll out and then you let the crosswind drift you back over the center line of the runway before you apply the rest of your crosswind correction versus ending up turning too late and doing a skidding turn on the final or a steep bank turn on the final. I think that's, but that comes with ground training, that comes with practice in the air and things like that. Stabilized final approach. So what's the, if you look in the glider flight manual, you'll see that the stabilized approach starts at about 200 feet. I think that's right. Is that correct, Rich?
Yes.
Yeah, starts at 200 feet.
Yeah.
You want to be stable. Go ahead.
The glider flying handbook currently says 100 feet. The new one
Okay.
doesn't give you an altitude.
Okay. The new one doesn't give you an altitude. Okay. Well, I would suggest that you want to be stabilized by at least 200 feet. Okay. What does that mean? That means you want to be in landing configuration, which means partial dive brakes, in my opinion. You want to be on the approach speed, so that doesn't mean the speed, but you want to be on the final approach pitch attitude, which will result in the final approach speed. And so those are two of the criteria. You have to be in landing configuration. That means you got to have the gear out. And if you have flaps on your glider, you have to have the flaps in landing configuration as well. So landing configuration, stabilized approach means on a glide path that'll get you to the runway, get you, not only to the runway, but into the touchdown zone area that you've chosen. And in landing configuration, gear down, flaps down, dive brakes partially open. This allows you to then talk about this wind gradient effect, which there's some controversy, and we, I won't say, we have good discussions at flight instructor clinics. It's because you'll have a sector of pilots that think that a wind gradient will make you go long, and you have a faction of pilots who think a wind gradient will make you fall short. I'm here to tell you that you're going to fall short if you fly the glider through the wind gradient. As you come down into a lessening headwind, intuitively you would say, if I'm going to come into a lessening headwind, I'm going to go long. But in reality, when you come into a lessening headwind, you actually go short. And the reason is because you have to make up for that loss of headwind energy by pitching the nose down farther to steep, and you have to steepen the approach to make up for that loss of gradient effect, that loss of headwind energy. So that dictates that you have to fly a little higher approach, to be quite honest. And there's almost always some kind of wind gradient on every runway that I've ever landed on. Even in light winds, you sometimes find yourself in some kind of small wind gradient. So I remember I had a landing I think I was flying an ASW 27, and the wind gradient was particularly strong that day. And I turned on the final approach, and everything looked pretty good. And suddenly the glider felt like it was just falling out from underneath me. I mean, it was like I was in an elevator going down, and it was the wind gradient affecting me. And I continued to pitch down a little bit to counteract that wind gradient. And I lessened the dive brakes, and I barely made it to the runway. I barely made it to the runway. So it happens even to the most experienced pilots. I mean, you have to think about it. You have to talk about it. You have to teach it. You have to make sure that people understand how the wind gradient effect has it. And one of the really good pictures came out of the old Joy of Soaring. And I'll try to. I was going to try to find it, and I forgot. I apologize. But the old Joy of Soaring had a very good picture of the wind gradient effect. And I'll try to find it and have it on the PowerPoints next lessons. Low energy touchdowns for training off airport landings. You know, you don't want to be touching down at 80 knots. You want to be at a ground speed of 80 knots. You want to be touching down as low of energy as you think that you can. So once you get down in the ground effect, you can start to slow down, or you should slow down, so that your actual touchdown and rollout is the minimum amount necessary. You know, you could, especially if you're an off airport landing, you could be up against a big hole that an animal has made in the runway or the landing area that you've chosen. You could have unseen from the air. You didn't pick out the fence that went across, a barbed wire, single strand barbed wire fence that ran right through the middle of the field. So you want to touch down with the lowest amount of energy. You know, I know a friend of mine years ago touched down with too much energy, and he actually ran through the single barbed wire fence with his glider. Fortunately, the barbed wire went up over the top, scratched the canopy the heck, but it didn't break it. And he didn't get injured, but it did scratch the heck out of his canopy. So, I mean, to try to say, I want to try to roll to the edge of the field so that make my retrieve all that much easier, I think is a misnomer and something that you want to try to dispel with your students. Assessment of the pilot's ability, knowledge evaluation. I use a guided discussion. That way I get feedback, instant feedback about what the way they're thinking or the way that your learner has studied or not studied. And, you know, I try to guide the discussion in the direction that I want it to go, but I try to let them be very involved with the discussion because I want to be able to get feedback from them as to what their perceptions and what their how they're going to treat those perceptions. Uh, Demonstrated ability. Use the common errors or the PTS guidelines. Looks like I got a little extra in there, a little extra. Oh, I'm not sure how that got in there, but you know, use the common errors, especially for student pilots. You want them to eliminate as many of those common errors, at least consistently eliminate them. And use the PTS guidelines if you're trying to train somebody for a practical exam. Post-flight evaluation. Use scenario-based training to enhance and reinforce the learning. So, you know, if you're in a post-flight evaluation and you're trying to stress something, you know, trying to stress the fact that, hey, you should have corrected for that crosswind a little differently, and you saw what happened there in that turn from base leg to final. You didn't line up with the runway. So the next time, how are you going to correct for that? You know, use your guided discussion methodology and ask them how are they going to correct for it, rather than just telling them, well, this is what you should do. You know, get some information from them to see if they are perceiving some of the lessons that you've given them in the past, and you can use scenario-based training to enhance that learning. So, first solo flight. You know, you want to make sure they're ready for that first solo flight, and because you want it to be a positive and confidence building experience. You know, if they make a poor landing, they make a bounce and they do a PIO and different, you know, they enter the pattern too low or whatever, that's not going to be a positive experience for them or you either. And so you want to really try to make sure that's going to be a positive experience. Make sure that they're consistently doing especially the approach and landing phase of it, consistently doing the things that are necessary to make that a positive and confidence building experience. Post solo, you know, immediate debriefing, both positive and areas to improve. You know, don't just leave it and just say, hey, good job, Bob, and pat them on the back. You know, just but you know, discuss the positive things that they did or that you observed that they did from the ground, and maybe a few areas that they might want to consider could be used for improvement. correction of learner errors, common things, not clearing the turns. And that's just in general, not clearing we're not talking about clearing the area for maneuvers. We're talking about not clearing before you turn, not maintaining coordination when turning. Remember, the law of primacy will dictate that the way they practice will be the way they perform. And so that you want to make sure that, from the very first, if they don't clear their turns, you want to just stop them. I usually put my hand right on the stick and I level the wings back out. I tell them, hey, I'm going to level the wings back out here because you didn't clear your turn. You didn't turn your head and look out to the side before the turn started. That would be the only time that, not the only time, but one of the times that I would probably not say I've got the flight controls. I might do it that way, but usually it's, as Bob said, Bob Wander said earlier, if you kind of let them make mistakes, but then quickly correct them, then now they're more prone to not doing that mistake again. So, pilot supervision.
Ron,
Go ahead.
Very briefly, if I have somebody who doesn't clear turns, I slap the stick hard. I don't take control of it. I just slap it. There's a moment of stunned silence in the front. They said, "What's up?" And I said, "Look, mate, don't look to please me. It's the 182 coming through the side of your head that I'm worried about. Clearing a turn you don't do to please the instructor. You do it to stay alive." Over.
Yeah. Do it to please yourself. Do it to stay alive. Good point, Bob. Pilot supervision. Instructors must maintain supervision of the learner during solo flights. So, you can't just blanket say, hey, just go out and do some solo flights and then turn around and do something else. You really want to be there to supervise. In fact, the insurance, the SSA insurance demands that a instructor supervision for solo flights is necessary. I believe they still demand that, don't they, Rich?
Absolutely, they do. Wander here. Over.
Yeah,
Correct.
absolutely do. Yep. So it's not only a good idea, but if your club is on SSA insurance, the SSA demands the insurer demands that those solo flights be supervised. Practical test recommendations: the instructor must know the required FAR endorsement and the training requirements. During the practical test for a flight instructor, it says something about, what endorsements would be necessary to do this or do that. But when I'm the examiner, I also include that I want you to be able to iterate what the training requirements are before you can make that endorsement, because that's your endorsement. That's your responsibility. And if you don't know what the training requirements are, well, how do you make that endorsement with good conscience? You have to know what the training requirements are and where they're found. Whether it's the PTS or whether it's like for solo flight, it's in 6187. Talks about the training requirements. You must know what their training requirements are before you make those endorsements. It's really important as an instructor. Sources of materials, we have printed materials. We kind of went through this last time, but it's the same. Electronic materials, Fighter Pilot Ground Schools. So a summary of the lesson. We talked about different methods of delivery, and the method of delivery I like is the facilitated debriefing, or the where you let your learner talk. And you gain a lot of insight. You, the instructor, gains a lot of insight as to the effectiveness of your teaching. And because if they're saying something that you didn't think that you taught them, well, then maybe you're not being too effective. And that's one easy way for you to be critique your training based on their perception of what they thought they heard you say or they thought they saw you do. Scenario-based training. We talked about a couple of different scenarios there, and it's really, again, it's the old hangar flying. When I got into this business, more than 50 years ago. We used to call it hanger fly. The old guys would sit around and say, "Oh yeah, I remember when this happened or when that happened." Well, that was scenario-based training in its infancy, but now we try to do it on a more conscious basis, and we make sure that it allows you, again, the instructor, to evaluate what your learner would do in different scenarios. If you're at 500 feet and you're still a mile from the runway, what are you going to do? That's the scenario. You've messed up. You got down to 500 feet and you're still a mile from the runway. How are you going to fly the pattern? How are you going to get that airplane that glider on the runway safely, and using the goal-oriented approach or whatever you're going to do to make that scenario come out successfully. It might be the most successful is to make an off-airport landing. That might be the best solution to that scenario too. A positive exchange of flight controls, very important that both you and the learner know who's flying the aircraft. We've all got stories, don't we, Bob and Rich? We all have stories. I'm sure Bert does too, about nobody flying the airplane or flying the glider. And so and suddenly we kind of, figured it out. Well, gee, aren't you flying? No, I'm not flying. Aren't you flying? No, I'm not flying either. So positive exchange of flight controls is one methodology to make sure that somebody is always flying the aircraft. The use of distractions. If you start talking about the football game or the baseball game or something like that, when you need to be paying attention, it's really important. Distractions are, I won't say they're the number one cause of accidents, but they certainly are a lead into the ability to, if you are distracted, you're not going to be paying attention to what you're supposed to be paying attention to. So try to avoid distractions, especially during critical phases of flight, takeoff, landing, and in the pattern, low altitude. Simulator training devices. The use of simulator training devices is growing, and I think that it's an important piece of the puzzle, so to speak, of training, and to try to you can accomplish a lot in the training devices that we have today. They're amazing. My friend Don Crush is in charge of the distribution of those training devices, and I think he still has a couple available for clubs and operations through the SSA, where they'll pay for half of the simulator costs, and the club or operation pays for the other half. And so I would encourage you to, if you're thinking along those lines, to contact the SSA. They'll put you in touch with Don Crush, and he'll set you up if he still has one. So, how to evaluate learners? Again, the facilitated debriefing, the guided discussion, different methods of delivery and evaluations is how to evaluate learners. And then we touched on endorsements and the importance of knowing what training has to be accomplished before you make endorsements. Because if you don't do the training and you make that endorsement, you're setting yourself up for some liability, to be quite honest, and you're setting your applicant, your learner, up. I won't say necessarily for failure, but certainly they're not as knowledgeable about what they need to be knowledgeable about as far as passing a check ride or even just flying solo. So I include this resource and references on every webinar. So it's the same stuff. Bob Wander has lesson plans. Russell Holtz has lesson plans and materials. Tom Knopf, his daughter is still, I'm sorry, it's Doris's daughter is still selling those things that she has available that Tom came up with over the years. Scott Manley, he does Condor Flight Simulator Instructor, has Condor videos, Soaring Safety website. Dave Seymour, so while talking about him, his next event, that says, will be in April. So there's one He's doing one next week, so we have a week off. I'm not going to be here on Wednesday next week, so this session won't be here next week. It'll be in 2 weeks from today, the next session for this ground school. But Dave Seymour has a 3-night Zoom meeting session for private, commercial, or CFI-G, gliderpilotsgroundschool.com. And it's a good preparation for taking the knowledge test and even for taking the oral preparation for the oral test, so for a check ride. So I would encourage you, if you're at all interested, to go to gliderpilotsgroundschool.com and sign up with Dave and get that, because we'll be off next week, but he's got a session going Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday night next week. So there's our future schedule. The February 11, 12, and 13 is with Dave Seymour, and that's next week. And then I'll be on for the 19th, Aviation Instructor's Handbook, Chapter 10, Teaching Practical Risk Management During Flight Instruction. And so I'll try to make up some scenarios again to try to point out how we utilize the PAVE model, how we actively try to mitigate the risks involved with flying gliders. And the references are the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, Chapter 1, and the Risk Management Handbook. There's an entire handbook on risk management, so you should look that up. I believe it's -01, I believe. It's either 01 or -02. So you should look up the Risk Management Handbook and download it off the FAA website if you want to, or buy one. I've got a hard copy of mine too. Questions? Here's some references that we used tonight to develop this lesson. Questions? Anybody? So I'm gonna get
Ron, Bob
Yeah.
wanted here, not a question, but just an observation. When it comes to student performance evaluation, when I was a young instructor, I just told everybody how they were doing, but you get smarter over the years. And I learned particularly after dual instructional flights, the first question I ask after we land and move the glider off the runway is, how'd you do? And I shut up and I listen. The candidate will tell me how he or she thought she did. If they get everything right, that is, if they nailed the stuff they did well, and if they nailed the stuff they didn't do very well, I say, good job. If they missed some aspect of their performance in their own self-evaluation, then we have a little chat about what that is. But if you really want to know what the candidate is thinking, you don't tell them, you ask them, and they will tell you. Over.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's a further clarification of what I call the facilitated debriefing. So you can start off by just, like Bob says, asking them, how do you think you did? You know, I quite often, when I'm done with a check ride, I do the same thing. I start off with that question, how do you think you did? And you'll get some hemming and hawing a little bit, and some will be pretty honest about it, and some won't be so honest about it. And depending upon, what my evaluation was, well then, we'll either go into it. But if it's just a critique, if I feel comfortable that they've adequately completed the check ride, I'll just do it more of a critique. But I agree with Bob. I mean, I like to hear how they feel they did, and see what they see how critical they are of their own personal flying. So I'm going to show you a Soaring Safety Foundation pattern and landing video here, and safety of flight considerations, PTS.
Ron, when you get that set up, there was a question for Bob if he's used the simulators before he's put people into the aircraft.
I use whatever resources are available at the time to get the candidate started. So if the simulator is first, that's fine. If the glider comes first, that's fine.
Now we're good.
The following video refers to the traffic pattern and landing tasks required in the FAA Commercial Glider Pilot Practical Test Standards. In this video, we'll cover items from Section 3, Area of Operation, Airport and Glider Port Operations, Item B, Task, Traffic Patterns, and Section 4, Area of Operation, Launches and Landings, Items Q, Normal and Crosswind Landings, and Item S, Downwind Landing. For the task Traffic Patterns, the objective is to determine that the applicant exhibits knowledge of the elements related to traffic pattern procedures for gliders, follows established traffic pattern procedures, maintains awareness of other traffic in the pattern, maintains proper ground track with crosswind correction if necessary, crosses designated points at appropriate altitudes unless conditions make such action impractical, selects touchdown and stop points, adjusts glide path and track promptly to compensate for unexpected lift, sink, or changes in wind velocity, makes smooth, coordinated turns with a bank angle not to exceed 45 degrees when turning final approach, adjust flaps, spoilers, or dive brakes as appropriate, recognizes and makes appropriate corrections for the effect of the wind, and completes the prescribed checklist if applicable. In both the normal and crosswind landings, the applicant must fly a landing pattern that assures the glider will always be able to fly a final approach path that is not too high or too low. Note that a glider pilot may modify the illustrated rectangular shape of the typical airplane-type traffic pattern in order to achieve the goal of landing the glider in the predetermined landing area and not short of the runway. For example, a glider pilot may decide to make an early turn from the downwind leg to base leg if a strong headwind on final exists, or if suspected sinking air or a wind gradient might result in a low or slow final approach. Discuss these possibilities and when it would be appropriate to use a flexible, goal-oriented pattern with your glider flight instructor. Area of Operation 4. Launches and Landings. Item Q, the task, landings, normal and crosswind landing. Note, if a crosswind condition does not exist, the applicant's knowledge of crosswind elements shall be evaluated through oral testing. The objective is to determine that the applicant exhibits knowledge of the elements related to a normal and crosswind approach and landing procedures. The applicant must be aware of the wind direction or wind speed and should verbalize to the examiner any changes in the wind speed or direction and any effect on the glider landing approach. Timely adjustments should be made throughout the landing pattern to assure a final approach that is over the extended center line of the runway. Height adjustments may include recognizing the effects of sinking air masses or rising air in the pattern. Subtle changes in the vertical speed may be monitored by the variometer trends and may require timely adjustment of the flaps, spoilers, or dive brakes as appropriate. A target airspeed is selected per the glider flight manual and for the effects of the winds aloft. Maintain the target airspeed within plus or minus 5 knots per the Commercial Glider Practical Test Standards. The applicant will maintain directional control and adjust the ground track for any crosswind drift with proper spacing from the runway throughout the pattern, or adjusting the timing of the turns in the pattern, or by crab or slip method as appropriate. The applicant should verbalize any compensating flight path adjustments to the examiner. Smooth and timely and positive application of the controls during round out and touchdown are required. Control movements should be timely in reaction to glider height or drift and result in a touchdown with no side loading on the landing wheels due to a drift from a crosswind. Upon touchdown, The glider's longitudinal axis must be aligned with the desired landing path and the touchdown be within the designated landing area. After rollout, the applicant will stop within 100 feet of a designated point ahead. Due to misunderstandings of this objective, the recent FAA clarification in the practical test standards states the applicant shall touch down and roll to a point designated by the examiner, stopping within 100 feet of the designated point without rolling past it. The point should be far enough away from the touchdown point that should not require more than light to medium braking to come to a stop within the required distance. The applicant must maintain directional and lateral control during the landing roll. Recognizing that the glider may weather vane into a crosswind is required, along with keeping the wings level with aileron inputs as long as possible. After the glider stops, the applicant will complete the appropriate checklist. It is recommended that the applicant move the glider clear of the runway for other aircraft as appropriate. Area of Operation 4, Launches and Landings. Item S, the task, Landings, downwind landing. The objective is to determine that the applicant exhibits knowledge of the elements related to downwind landings, including safety-related factors. Adjusts flaps, spoilers, or dive brakes as appropriate. Maintains recommended approach airspeed within plus or minus 5 knots. Uses proper downwind landing procedures. Maintains proper directional control during touchdown and rollout. Applies brakes smoothly to bring the glider to a stop. Common student errors. Not recognizing the effect of a crosswind on the flight path. Not adjusting for a change in wind direction and wind speed that may have occurred after takeoff and during free flight that may affect the flight path in the approach and landing. An early turn from base leg to final, angling toward the runway on final approach, may require a last-second turn with a wingtip close to the ground or obstacles. A delayed turn from base to final that results in an overshoot of the turn to final, perhaps by not recognizing a tailwind on the base leg. Not making coordinated turns in the pattern. Skidding the turn to align the glider after an overshoot on final approach is dangerous. Not recognizing the need to timely extend or reduce the spoilers, flaps, or dive brakes to control the glide path. This task in the PTS requires smooth, timely, and positive control application throughout the approach and touchdown. Insufficient airspeed and altitude when crossing the last obstacle, or not recognizing a wind gradient that may cause the glider to make a very low energy approach and possibly land short of the runway. Hunting for the ground during roundout, possibly resulting in pilot-induced oscillations. Pitching up after roundout to an excessive nose-high attitude just above the runway, resulting in a stall into the ground. Forcing the glider onto the runway, usually when the pilot has flown past the desired touchdown point, often a result of excessive airspeed on final approach or insufficient extension of spoilers, flaps, or dive brakes. After touchdown, slow to recognize and react if the glider weather vanes into a crosswind, allowing it to roll left or right well outside the designated landing area. After touchdown, allowing a wing to drop on the tip by not being proactive in keeping the wings level. Greater inputs may be required by the pilot to maintain wings level as long as possible. As the glider slows, the controls will become less effective. After stopping, not completing an appropriate checklist. Discuss this PTS requirement with your flight instructor. For example, a checklist may be as short as get out of the glider, check for landing air traffic, promptly move the glider clear of the landing area, turn off electrical and oxygen systems, close and lock the canopies, Secure or tie down the glider to prevent wind damage. Install control locks. Common student errors: downwind landing, not flying an appropriate pattern, accounting for the drift on base leg and a higher ground speed on final approach. Slow to recognize changes in altitude or the effect of the glider from any vertical movement of sinking or rising air in the landing pattern and final approach, and adjusting the flaps, spoilers, or dive brakes as appropriate. Not maintaining an appropriate predetermined indicated airspeed plus or minus 5 knots per the commercial glider pilot practical test standards. Does not utilize the standard downwind landing procedures referenced in the glider flight manual or the FAA glider flying handbook. Does not recognize the changes in ground track and increased ground speed on final approach or at round out and touchdown when making a downwind landing. Not recognizing that on the longer rollout after touchdown on a downwind landing, the flight controls become much less effective as the glider slows down. The pilot must anticipate this loss of control effectiveness on the rollout so the glider remains in control near the center line of the landing area. As the glider landing roll distance may be much farther than usual after touchdown when landing downwind, the pilot fails to smoothly apply wheel brake in a timely manner to stop the glider at a desired point.
Bert, I'd like to make a quick comment about the landing patterns. We get a lot of, can you all hear me? 10-4? Hello?
Yep, 5x5. Over.
Thank you. We get a lot of pushback from transition pilots from the airplane world who, and their CFI-Gs who are from the airplane world, who teach a very square pattern, going far downwind to where the runway is 45 degrees over your shoulder. That's pretty darn too far. They really push back on that pattern shape. And I remind them that any delay in turning base, you're going every second 100 feet further downwind. You know, you're doing 55 or 60 in the pattern, but you got that tailwind. 60 miles an hour, you're going 88 feet per second. We all learned that in driver's ed. So every second they go further and they wait 5 seconds, they've gone 500 feet. And of course, the irony is now they're 500 feet too far and they got to buy back that 500 feet through the sink and the headwind and et cetera. Also, I want to make a comment on the lesson plans. I wanted to quote Bob Wander. I remember so much that he says. Between my dad and Bob Wander, I got lots of cool little tips. Bob Wander says, when they push back, we're not saying that SSF, we're not saying you shouldn't do a square pattern or a rectangular pattern. You can do right, left, anything. In fact, gliders at non-towered airports, by exception, only airplanes must make left patterns at non-towered airports. But anyway, Bob Wander said this: look, we're not trying to tell you what to do. Quote, I hope I'm right. It's just another tool in your landing pattern toolbox. Am I correct, Bob? Did you say that?
What I try and tell people is the landing pattern in a glider is really different from airplane world. And I prefer not to use the word pattern for gliders at all. I just say it's an approach. There may be a normal pattern, but it's an approach. Solve the problem of making a safe landing is the mantra that I, the last 10 years, come to use over and over. Solve the problem. Just executing a pattern may or may not solve the problem. You need to think outside the box once in a while. Thanks, Bert. Over.
This was all comes from Derek Piggott, the legendary British flight instructor, who realized that the most common accident in the gliding world or incident is landing short of a runway you just passed and went too far downwind. And so a lot of people swear by the 45 degrees over your shoulder, or go fly, and worse, go fly to the windmill and turn base. That's crazy. Even relying on an altimeter, people say, "Oh, I turn base at 300 feet or whatever number." Well, if you take off and go to another place like we do in West Texas, we're at 5,000 feet. Pecos, 100 miles away, is at 3,000 feet. So don't rely on the altimeter so much. That's why we have on the check ride the covered altimeter off airport landing thing. And back to lesson plans, the student can purchase a book that includes the criteria for your lesson plans for the lesson. And especially the common student errors are laid right out by a book called a little booklet, Inexpensive Learning to Fly Gliders by Bob Wander. That is for the instructor and the student. It's very clear on the basic maneuvers that Bob has outlined, the completion standards, what it's going to take, and your common student errors. And if the student will purchase this, it also has that checklist in the back of where they can when introduced to a task and a maneuver. Just another concise, to the point book by Bob Wander.
Yeah, well, thanks, Bert. But folks, thank you, Bert, for the compliments. I appreciate it. Folks, use what works for you. I'm not here to make a commercial sale. My fortune is made, thanks. So find what works for you, for your people and your club, and have it be thorough. Make sure it's a good collection of lesson plans, and that you track each candidate's progress through your training program, and you'll be fine. Over.
And I'd just like to make a comment on the law of primacy. If we demonstrate some kind of regular rectangular approach for the first 30 to 50 flights that the candidate goes through, and then you tell them, oh, by the way, you don't need to do this, they will do it. You need to demonstrate that you can make a non-standard approach, just as Ron said earlier, base to final, during their initial part of their training. I do it on flight 2, and demand that what they're recognizing is we need to make the goal, not a specific ground track. You're on mute, Ron.
Well, while
now
Ron recovers his...
Now I'm off. Go ahead.
Are you back, Ron? Over?
I'm
okay.
back. Go ahead, Bob. Go ahead.
Just briefly, I was going to expound on what 2 excellent career flight instructors just said. And I do it this way now. I tell people, look, in glider, the pattern that airplane people fly is like a recipe. If you do this, and then this, and then this, you hope that the cake will turn out. So here's a question for you. I give you a cake mix. It's all ready to go into a 400-degree oven, and the recipe says bake it for 1 hour. You put the cake in the oven. 45 minutes later, not an hour, but 45 minutes later, you see black smoke coming out of the oven. Now, what are you going to do? Are you going to save the cake? Or are you going to just follow the recipe through until you have a fire, and a 3-alarm fire? Because obviously, in this case, the 1 hour at 400 degrees recipe is not working to make the cake come out. Flying a glider approach is like the same thing. If the pattern, the recipe, isn't working, the normal standard pattern and landing isn't working, then do what it takes to bake the cake to achieve a safe outcome landing on the spot intended. Thanks.
So
And that spot, sorry,
go ahead,
that
Rich.
spot
Go
may
ahead.
not be the runway.
Yeah, maybe an off-airport landing. I mean, you have to make a decision sometimes that you're not going to make the airport, and so you might have to pick another spot that's safe and evaluate that and for its own merits, and then make an approach to that new spot, so to speak. So I hope that I hope that everybody's getting an idea about the videos that I'm showing, and I hope that's a good training tool that I'm using for you. I'm trying to expose you, the new flight instructors, to that training tool because I think that it can be very valuable. And so I want you to consider using it on an ongoing basis because it's there for, the Soaring Safety Foundation has put some money into developing those tools, and Bert Compton and Scott Manley have put quite a bit of time in developing those tools for us, and for all of us, not just us in the Soaring Safety Foundation, but for every single one of us as instructors. And so I want you to know that they're there and try to utilize those tools so that you can produce a better result, a little better understanding for your students, a little better understanding for yourselves as instructors, what what the examiners, fighter flight examiners will probably be looking for. So try to utilize those tools, and that's one reason I'm exposing everybody at the end of the seminars here, at the end of each one, to some of those tools. So, do we have any comments? Or I can't see the comments yet, Rich or Bob or anybody. Ken, haven't heard from you, Ken. Now you're off mute. There you go.
I'm still here. I guess
Okay.
one comment I would make, just kind of a general comment, is that if your learner is having difficulty with something, sometimes it works to try a different phraseology, try to do things differently. I had a student who was having trouble on tow, maintaining the proper height, and kept telling him to keep the tow plane on the horizon, and he just wasn't able to do it. And I went out of town for a while, came back a few weeks later and flew with him, and he had it nailed. And he'd flown with a different instructor while I was gone. And I told him, when I asked him, I said, what happened? What did you do to figure this out? And he says, well, he said, he told me to keep the horizon on the tow plane.
That's
And I
great.
said, okay, I get it.
Okay. I get it.
So the way that you can describe things can make a difference, apparently.
We're here. On the toe, going back to that, I wish we would stop saying high toe. It should be defined as normal toe. Some students read that in the books. The other thing they see in the book is a frozen picture of the toe plane ahead. And I say, just keep it in the ballpark. And if they slide out of position, I simplify it, like Ken says, freeze it and fix it. Don't, oh, I'm out of position, swoop back in, you got a ton of slack and you're out of position and things like that. So freeze it and fix it is a knowledge that I use.
Yeah, that's a good terminology.
Derek Piggott has a book called Soaring Safety, where he talks to instructors and he says basically the student only hears the first 6 words you say. So Tom Wander said this in his lectures, an economy of words is what we have to, and go home, practice, instructors alone, and see how tight you can get your commentary along. For God's sakes, do a pre-flight briefing. Today we're going to work on false ones because it is a false one. Okay. So, economy of words, very strong statement for instructors to learn. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks, Bert.
We'll go to my FAE.
Good point. So I think we're going to call it an evening. We've been at it for a couple hours now, and I think we're going to call it an evening. Thank you for your attention. I know it's getting late on the East Coast. It's 11 o'clock, and so I think we'll call it an evening. Thanks again. We'll see you. I'll see you in 2 weeks on this presentation, and we're going to talk about risk management and flight instruction, and But next week, if you're so inclined, take in Dave Seymour's presentation. I think that you will find it worthwhile, especially if you need to take the knowledge test, and but even just preparation for the oral gets you thinking about some of the different aspects like that. So, and if you have any comments or suggestions for me, send them along, because that's how I try to improve. I'm not sure that it always works, but I try to make these things interesting and improve as we move forward.
Just one comment, Ron. Nice
Yes.
tie. Nice tie.
Thanks. This is the Rich Carlson. We got to wear ties, right, Rich?
Exactly.
You got to look professional. So, okay. Thanks again for your attention. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Take care.
Thanks, Ron.